Okay, so in this video we're going to look at channel strips. Channel strips are a really awesome way of incorporating some analog style EQs into your workflow. I tend to use these when I've done my final arrangement and all that sort of stuff, and then I'm doing my final mix down. I tend to use a channel strip on pretty much every channel that I've used in my track, and then I will process that and sweeten it up with the EQs in the channel strip, and it just gives it a bit of an analog flavor, and I just enjoy putting it on there. It tends to have some pretty good results in the final mix. So I've got two channel strips that we're going to be looking at today. They're both from Brainworks. And the first one is this Brainworks or BX console SSL 4000E. This is based on the SSL 4000E desk or the console, and it has some really awesome features. It sounds great. So channel strips just give you a different EQ flavor to your surgical sort of style parametric EQs like the Pro Q3 and that we've been looking at in this series so far. So it just gives you, like I said, a bit of a different flavor, and it'll give you some analog vibe. Okay, so let's have a look at this SSL channel strip here. Okay, so we've got our EQ controls in this column here, and we've got our filters in here. We've also got some dynamics controls here, some compression and expansion and stuff like that, but because this is an EQ course, I'm not really going to delve into those. Okay, so we're just going to be using the EQ section of the channel strip here in the filters. All right, so let's look from the top left. We've got our high pass and low pass filters. So the high pass filter is good for, cutting out the bottom end of the track that you're working on, and the low pass filter is good for just sort of, getting rid of some tops and stuff like that and shaping it. So you've got these ×3 and divide by 3. So as you can see, when I sweep this high pass filter goes from 16 Hertz up to 350. If I do times by 3, it gives it some more range. So it goes right up to just over 1K. And if I do divide by 3, it's sort of vice versa, but with the low pass. Okay, so it goes from 7K down to 1K as opposed to 22K down to 3K. It just gives it some more range. Okay. Then we've got a high shelf here. And that is sweepable from 1.5K up to 16K, and I can just boost or attenuate that. You see it sort of adds, if you look at the spectrum analyzer here, that really brings up that top end there, and that's because there's some noise sort of happening and some analog non-linearities that are modeled in here. So it's modeling, the sound of the desk as well as the flavor and style of the EQs and the shape of them. So we've got that high shelf. We've got two mid EQs. Okay, so we've got our high mid and we've got our low mid. So the high mid is sweepable from 600 Hertz up to 7K. It has a Q control, and it has a attenuate and boost. So that's our gain control there. So it is parametric. And then we've got our low mid. So these are bell shape EQs, by the way. We've got our low mid, which covers 200 Hertz up to 2.5K, and again, Q and gain control here. Down the bottom, we've got a shelving EQ for the low end. So that's just going to boost the lows from sweepable from 30 Hertz up to 450. Now, a really cool thing that you can do with this is this EQ type. So I can change it and it's going to give it a different flavor. But also if I click this shelf button down either the low shelf or the high shelf, I get a bell curve on this instead of a shelving EQ. So I can change that out if I wanted to add another sort of bell style EQ, either up the top or the bottom. I can do that with that. So that's kind of handy. Although I tend to just leave it on the shelf. Okay. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be processing a bit of a hip hop style drum break with this SSL, and then I'm going to show you a different channel strip, which is based on a Nave desk. I'll talk about that one in a sec. And we're going to sort of compare the differences between the two EQs with similar settings. Okay, so this is the break sound. I'm just going to unengage that for a sec and compare whether even just having this on adds something. I'm just going to fully reset the whole EQ there. Okay, let's turn it off. So you can tell even just by engaging that channel strip, it's actually added a bit of warmth and some bottom end to the sound. Let's have another listen. It's pretty subtle, but it's there, definitely there. And that's because it's in this analog mode, so it's modeling the sort of feel of the desk there. Okay, so let's have a look at the filters first. So this is the high pass filter down the bottom. With the times through. Then the low pass. High shelf. Low shelf. And the mid EQs. Okay, so that's kind of the ranges of those different EQ shapes. Now I'm going to start EQing this break as if I would be in a mix down. Okay, so the way I sort of treat this is that I tend to use the low pass filter just to cut out some of the bottom end that's not needed there. So I'm going to just set that about 30 Hertz. Then I'm just going to leave the low pass filter because I don't think I need that for this particular break. But if you wanted to cut out some of the highs, you could bring it down. And then the shelf, I tend to, depending on the sound, but for this break, I'm just going to sort of push up the top end at about 12K or so. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a bump around, 2 dB. I think that should be okay. Okay, so I tend to boost the high and the low shelves at different frequencies, again, depending on the sound, but that's usually how I approach these channel strips. I'm just going to turn it down a little bit because as I am pushing up the gains on that EQ, I need to balance it out so I'm not just hearing the volume increasing. Yep, that's about right. Okay, so then with the mid-range EQs, with the high mid, I tend to boost this one. Depending, again, this is dependent on the sound. This is a general rule of thumb that I approach these channel strips with my mix downs, but I tend to boost with the high mid and cut with the low mid. Reason being is the high mid is where our sort of presence of the sound and the clarity of a particular sound is focused in, and especially like if we're talking drums, a lot of the punch and that sort of stuff happens at around sort of 2K, not so like, that sort of bit that cuts through the mix, that happens around 2K. And for anything melodic, so like a synthesizer or a vocal or things like that, 3K to about sort of 4.5K is where the sort of sweet spot of that is, because that's where our ears pick that up. So for clarity and things like that, that's the regions you want to focus on. So I tend to sort of give those a bit of a boost, again, dependent on the sound, okay? Because if I'm boosting that, 3K on every single sound, then that's just going to be a terrible mix down. So I don't boost 3K on every single sound. I'll sort of boost maybe some at 1, some at 2, some at 3, depending again on the mix and what it needs. But this is just a general rule of thumb for the way I approach these channel strips. The low mid, I tend to use that as a cut. And so I will generally focus around this range from about 200 to about 500-600, where that mud can sit in sounds, and just sort of pull that out and the amount that I pull out will depend on the sound, and the frequency I set it at will depend on the sound as well. I tend to go for a narrow cue if I'm cutting and a broader cue if I'm boosting. Okay, so let's have a play around. I'm going to start with the high mid and then I'm going to move down to the low mid. So usually I'm not EQing like this where I've just got the instrument soloed, but I'm just sort of processing these drums just to give you a bit of an idea of, you know, how I would approach this sort of thing in a mix down context. Okay, so I think that sounds pretty cool and I kind of like it better than without it. So what we're going to do now is going to move over to this BX Console N and see how this compares using similar EQ settings with the SSL style. So the SSL style of channel strip I tend to use for things that are quite melodic and intricate, whereas the Nave style I tend to go for that when I'm doing things that are a lot heavier, maybe sort of more dance floor focused music, you know, particularly heavier techno and that sort of stuff. I usually like to drive that into the Nave style because I just like the way that it sort of distorts and is a bit more in your face and up front. Okay, so let's have a look at the Nave. So side by side, you can see a similar layout, but we've got some different sort of settings and things like that. So we've still got our filters over here, but they've been swapped around. So we've got low pass and high pass instead of high pass and low pass. So I'm going to set my high pass at, well, it's already set at 30 Hertz, so I don't need to do that. But you can tell we've got the ×3 and divide by 3 to change the ranges of those. We've got a whole compression and dynamics section here. Then we've got our high shelf and low shelf. So the high shelf here, I'm going to set that again at about 12K. And what was my boost here? Was about 2.7. Okay. So again, I can change that to a shelf or a bell. I've got this high Q mode as well, which adds some resonance to the curve. So the high Q button, that reacts in the same way as turning up the Q when we're looking at the shelving EQs, particularly if we look at the low shelf down here. The high Q works in the same way that it sort of adds some resonance below, if we're talking the low shelf, it adds some resonance below the cutoff point and it cuts out a bit of the information just above the cutoff point. So it gets, you can use that for kick drums and things like that. I'm just going to leave that off for now. Okay, so then we've got our high mid. I'm going to set that at 2.3K and that had a boost of about 3 dB. Oh, 4.5. I went a bit aggressive on there. And the Q was down about here. What was that? 0.8. Obviously these settings are going to be different because it's, you know, applicable to the different channel strips and how they react at different settings, but we'll match it and see what we get. And then the cut I had down here in the low mid was about 420 and I cut that out about 2.5. I didn't go too crazy because it just sucks some of the life and the weight out of the break there. So I didn't want to go too crazy on that. And then a narrow Q. And then I sort of boosted those lows pretty hard at about 100 Hertz. And that was about 5.2. Okay, so let's see how that sounds now. Got to pull down that output. You can see they're very different. The EQ setting that I've got in the Nave, you can tell that it's way more aggressive and it's pushed things harder than the SSL desk. The SSL desk is sort of quite refined and silky, whereas the Nave is a bit more in your face. So let's have another listen. Particularly in the bottom end. Yeah, I think I prefer, for that particular break, I think I prefer the Neve style desk as opposed to the SSL. But then again, that's that type of break. So this is, you know, a crusty hip hop break, and I wanted things to be a bit dirty and punchy and weighty, rather than sort of intricate, beautiful melodies and stuff like that, which I would probably use for the SSL. SSLs tend to be used a lot for, you know, pop music and stuff like that, whereas the Neves tend to go for more, you know, analog rock instruments and things like that, and more aggressive, in your face sort of techno and that sort of thing is what I would use that on. So that's a bit about the channel strips. I hope you enjoyed that video, and I will see you over in the next one.